Hello my dears, welcome to another video. Glad to have you here. Apologies for not having a new video last Saturday. I am working on a handful of deep dive videos and did not account for the extra 3 days that I got stuck in a research rabbit hole and I couldn't get out. It happens. But anyway, welcome. Today we're going to talk about another one of those things that you don't realize is disability related and instead just think that you're a bad person, because we love unpacking trauma via looking at the world differently over here. Also, if you're new here, hi, my name is Sydney. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a white person in their early 20s with shoulder-length light brown curly hair. I'm currently wearing a black and white checkered shirt with some flowers on it and clear round glasses, and I'm sitting in front of a bookshelf. I'm an openly queer, disabled, autistic, trans, non-binary actor, composer, educator, and disability advocate, currently working on a thesis about disability education, media, theater, performance, accessible education, basically anything else in any and all of those categories, and it is culminating in the world's first all-neurodivergent cast and crew production of The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. You can learn about any and all of those things at the links in my description. I make videos about any and all of those things as well. You are welcome to subscribe if you want to stick around, or leave a like, or a comment, whatever brings you joy, but no pressure. Let's talk about pathological demand avoidance, also known as persistent drive for autonomy, also known as baby anarchy. The last one's a little bit less of a scientific medical term than the first two, but I like it a lot, and also why medicalize a word, but that's a discussion for later in this video because we have some stuff to learn about and unpack before we can get to that point. I'm like very energized today and I need to chill. Pathological demand avoidance, or PDA, is a profile of autism that comes down to a strong need for control, making people with PDA perceive any loss of autonomy as a life or death situation and therefore have extreme reactions to demands and expectations. Many professionals have renamed and reframed it as persistent drive for autonomy to be less pathological and deficit-oriented, and because we see both so commonly used, it is usually just referred to as PDA to prevent any confusion, which arguably causes a lot more confusion in the general world, because when I see something that's like PDA in children, my immediate thought is public displays of affection in children, which is a very alarming thought to have, but in keeping with the norms, we're just gonna say PDA throughout the video anyway, because I don't want to say the whole long thing and I kind of want to use both. Anyway, okay. So the term pathological demand avoidance was first created in the 1980s by Professor Elizabeth Newson to describe a particular behavior profile that she had seen when assessing autistic children. It was first published in a 2003 paper where she proposed it as a new and distinct syndrome rather than kids with PDA being lumped in under the label of autism or pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. Historical note, PDD-NOS was subsumed into the autism spectrum category in the same way that Asperger syndrome was in 2013, so it no longer exists as a diagnostic criteria anyway, but that's beside the point. The paper says that it should be a distinct diagnosis because analysis shows PDA to be significantly different on many counts from classic autism and Asperger syndrome, both separately and together, including an equal sex ratio, 150 cases. Demand avoidance using social manipulation is seen in all children, which strongly contrasts with the features of autism spectrum disorders. It didn't happen. PDA did not make it into the DSM back then, nor is it in the DSM or ICD today. There's also seems to be kind of insufficient evidence to support PDA as a subtype of autism or an independent condition, according to a 2018 study, and so it is described as an autistic profile instead. A medical profile is a group of behaviors that can be used to describe many people within a diagnostic category, but it's not a distinct syndrome or diagnosis, here being within the autism category. As a concept, it's often not talked about by clinicians because it means very different things to different people, and it's unclear how useful as a designation it actually is. It's also unknown if it's just a certain personality type intersecting with autism, or if it's a trauma response, or if it's just a healthy assertion of autonomy, or something else entirely. It's not really a concrete thing that can be nailed down, and doctors don't really like those things, so it kind of gets left behind. But then there's also like a whole discussion to be had as to whether this phenomenon exists at all. A lot of experts think that no, or it's a bunch of traits from other things grouped unnecessarily into a new category. I think that no matter what, it's a commonly talked about thing that helps some people to understand and better accommodate for personal experiences and for the experiences of others, just like any other diagnostic label that may or may not accurately reflect reality because human behavior doesn't fit into categories. But that is an argument for another day. I personally have never really heard PDA mentioned in the psychology or medical domain. I've only heard it, and I hear it fairly frequently in these settings, in the special education and in the here's how to parent your disabled child domain, and also more recently coming up more commonly in the autistic adult community. But again, I personally think that like most other diagnoses, PDA lives in a realm of like, well, I don't think it should be deemed as a disorder, I don't think it's a disorder at all, but having a word for it helps us to understand and accommodate for these particular experiences, and that is very important. I also take great issue with the amount of times writings on PDA refer to children's behavior as manipulative, because that word has such strong connotations, and trying to be like, well, their disability means that they don't mean it, or realize that they're doing it, they're just manipulative by default. feels gross, and I don't love that. We're gonna get to that later. Anyway, traits as listed in the initial study are very deficit-oriented to the point where they're kind of offensive, so we're gonna just ignore that, and I'll link in the description if you're interested, but we're gonna ignore that. We're going to instead talk about it in the way that the autistic advocacy community talks about it today, in the realm of what does it look like, and how do we experience it, and how can we accommodate for it, and how can we reframe it as a different way of looking at human behavior in a more empathetic and compassionate manner, rather than just a, oh, you have a disorder, so you're therefore bad and you need to fix it to be a good person, but also not in a, well, it's my disability, so like this behavior that really hurts other people is okay and fine because I can't help it either, because that's also not what we want here. So there are kind of two categories of responses that PDA people tend to have, and then a lot of other things more in the gray area that look at the wider life experience more than just like one isolated event that you can be like, oh yes, a symptom, because humans are way more complicated than that. But let's look at the two categories first to get a general idea before we expand on that. So the first category is outward responses. This is the explosive behavior that we typically think of when we imagine an autistic child. They may scream, bite, throw things, may physically attack, kick their safe person, those kinds of things. The second category is the inward response. This is the internal explosion where a person may shut down, feel their heart racing, feel tingly or dissociate, go silent, or just can't communicate what's going on. This response is observed more commonly in teens than in children. There's this concept of leveling or compensation behavior that goes along with PDA. I found a lovely human on Instagram who writes about raising PDA kids and caregiver boundaries and self-care. Her account is at Peace Parents. I will link in the description for you because you definitely should check it out if you're a parent. But I'm gonna just paraphrase some sections of her post about leveling more than I usually like to paraphrase things, because otherwise I would end up trying to explain it and I would do an objectively worse job. Basically, there are behaviors that are the outward expressions of a PDAer's threat response being activated, and they're pretty much out of their control. They're called leveling or compensation behaviors because it's a behavior that tries to get things back into balance when there's a perceived loss of autonomy. And there are three kinds of triggers for leveling behaviors. The first is direct stimuli. This is the most immediate and clear response. An example given in the post on this being a kid who was told that he couldn't get closer to the fire because it was dangerous. And the more that he got told no, the more he started to physically fight the adults and then eventually try to run towards the fire. Another example would be somebody being like, hey, you can't hit your brother. And the kid responds by just destroying something of their brother's instead. It is them directly feeling like they're losing their autonomy to make decisions by being told what to do, and therefore they need to correct that. Except the way that they correct that is in an uncontrollable fight or flight manner that from the outside may seem super out of proportion to the immediate situation. The second is cumulative stimuli. This is when someone spends a lot of time in a high masking environment where they're forced to constantly override their threat responses and conform to societal norms, and then they return to their safe space and may just completely explode. That explosion may look like controlling behavior toward their routines or objects or the other people that they live with. A lot of this is just exhaustion in the same way that when 10 bad things happen to you in one day at work and you hold it together and then you finally get to your car at the end of the day and you cry for a while and then you're just kind of irritable and exhausted and annoying when you get home for the rest of the day. It's a very similar situation. PDAers often manifest this by trying to control everything that they possibly can and exploding if things aren't the right way. This is one of the major reasons that OCD is often misdiagnosed in autistic children, and then they go to OCD exposure therapy, which in this case wouldn't help because OCD is a completely different root cause. But this is often the case for parents who are like, my child hits me all the time and when she's at home, but she's an angel at school, so it must be my fault that I'm parenting her wrong or something. That's not the case at all. It's nothing against you at all. It is not your fault. It's just her trying to cope. And this also doesn't have to be like oh, they were at school and then they came home and they exploded. It can also be like oh, they've been working with one person on this thing over and over and over and over and over again and being a perfect angel, being masked, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And they finally get somebody who actually works really well with them and they match with more perfectly, and then they completely fall apart and explode. And that person is like, oh my gosh, am I bad at my job, when they're actually the best person at their job, if that makes any sense at all. The third trigger is implicit stimuli. These are things that are more silent pressure, so cultural, familial, societal expectations. This may be insisting on doing a homework assignment out of order, or on not doing the homework assignment at all. It could be wearing clothes inside out, or refusing to wear an ugly Christmas sweater to an ugly Christmas sweater party. It's a way of trying to take autonomy over an oppressive world. Some classic leveling responses for outward reacting PDAers can include knocking things over, destroying something that you made, calling you a name, telling you to stop talking, controlling whether you can go to the bathroom or eat a meal, or spitting or kicking or screaming. Leveling responses for inward reacting PDAers can include staying up all night, disordered eating, and forms of self-harm. Other PDA experiences that I found that I have and heard from other creators include saying no to things I might actually want to do just to have control over them, even if that's avoiding opportunities, appointments, and important meetings, just because I don't have control over them and they make me too anxious to even start, so it's easier to just say no and not do anything. It can mean going from absolutely fine and happy-go-lucky about things to a complete meltdown in a very short period of time when things go wrong or I lose control of a situation. In fact, the happier that I am, the quicker that switch flips, because I'm on edge solely by how much I need things to be perfectly happy. Because I'm like, oh, this is the best day ever and it's got to continue being the best day ever, and blah, blah, blah. That happens. It's not doing things unless I'm fully sure that I can do them the perfect way, eventually making me so anxious about it that I just can't bring myself to do the thing, which is why I'm really good at critiquing and being a second eye on stuff and compiling information, but I have a very, very hard time creating or organizing things completely from scratch. I need very strong inspiration to work off of if I'm gonna do something like that. It can be getting literally stuck where I want to do something, but I feel like my brain is locked and I can't dislodge it until something happens, becoming obsessed for hours about seemingly small and meaningless things. And if I don't have a set routine to do things or an exact time to do things, I physically cannot force myself to do it. So I just spend the whole day getting more and more and more anxious about the thing until the reason I can't do it is because I'm too anxious about it, not because my brain is locked. And also the brain lock. It's a combo experience and it sucks. It can be getting defensive at all kinds of demands, especially ones that I perceive to be a sort of expectation, because it needs to be something that I initiate or choose to do. And if somebody continues to encourage me to do something after I say no, I go straight to panic mode immediately, no matter how nicely they say it. I believe this one was from Lived Experience Educator on Instagram, but I didn't write that down. But they said that they find that their PDA manifests in them quitting jobs after 6 months because they like doing the job and proving themselves at the beginning, but then once that behavior becomes expected, they lose interest and quit. Which I realized that I also, on some level, really prefer doing temp jobs rather than like very long-term jobs. And I've structured YouTube in such a way that it is temp. It's like off and it's on, it's off, it's on, so that I get that new rejuvenated energy. And I also think that's partially why I love working in the theater, because when you're working on a new project, it goes through the whole process and everything's changing every day. It's not consistent, this is your job all the time like a lot of other jobs are. I also find that PDA can be strongest with the things I'm most passionate about or the demands that I set for myself. If somebody tells me how I'm supposed to be doing something that I'm really, really good at, even if I'm still learning and I'm like, yeah, I could use advice, I immediately feel like I cannot do the thing that they've told me, even if it will help me, because I just cannot. Everything my body says absolutely not, which is why I watch other people learning skills and having lessons about things on the internet and watch them getting critiqued, and then I take notes from that because that takes me out of my own fight or flight and I'm able to learn that way. All of this kind of ties into some things I've had bookmarked for a while about rigid thinking and the line between rigid thinking and mental compulsions of getting stuck on thoughts, or particularly self-loathing thoughts or intrusive thoughts, and ruminating on one thing over and over and over and over to try to figure it out even when that thing doesn't really matter, or reviewing memories over and over again and trying to turn bad thoughts in the brain into good thoughts. And those are technically categorized as OCD compulsive thoughts, but everything's categorized. And whatever. There are also positives to this, right? Like, we can't just be like, this is bad, because that's not nuanced enough for us here. But also, like, no trait is inherently bad. PDAers tend to find answers to problems that other people don't even bother to try to tackle. We also tend to be very clear at setting boundaries, even if not in the most graceful way all the time. Our constant desire to find the why and to feel in control of things makes us very good at thinking critically and logically and learning new things when we want to. And there's also something really important to be said about how our inability to accept poor treatment or anything less or abuse from authority is somewhat ingrained in us, and we are always going to fight that. From the outside, though, all of these traits are often seen as stubborn, manipulative, and controlling. I often find that people like how stubborn and persistent I am and how I never give up, and they always compliment me on that until suddenly I'm not giving up on something that's in direct opposition to what they want, and then suddenly it's a problem, which is very confusing when somebody spends your whole friendship praising a particular quality of yours only to cite that as the reason that they think you're a terrible person and never want to speak to you again at some point. But, many educators and mental health providers expect children to comply with instructions, regardless of whether they understand or agree, so any struggle or hesitation is pathologized. If a child isn't on board with what's being demanded of them, then what we call PDA is actually a really powerful act of consent and self-advocacy. Please, for the sake of yourself and for this movement, do not stop at just thinking that the problem is located within you. It is not. How you are is not wrong or bad or pathological. Needing support, structure, hope that your life is worth putting energy into, love, engagement, stimulation, and enthusiastic consent in order to take action is not a defect. You deserve better than thinking your need for autonomy is a pathology. You can be freer than that. So going back to this idea of why should we not pathologize this? When I first researched this whole thing, I was like, this is probably mostly just societal issues, and it seems like a trauma response to oppression, honestly, but I think that if we took out societal pressures, I personally would still find that somewhat disabling because it does prevent me from doing the things I love sometimes, so maybe we should pathologize it on some level. But I was reminded of the fact that On some level, the reason I have this trauma response to the things that I love is because I have this response to everything across the map. And that this response to everything across the map was, on some level, a learned coping skill that, had I not had societal pressures to begin with, I never would have learned it to have it to become a problem with the things that I do love. And that was a very convoluted thing, so let me rephrase that better. As an autistic and as a disabled person, my entire life has been, you cannot do this, or you need to do things this way. Either from a literal, you will never be able to do this because of your disability, or I need you to put on these tights even though you hate them because it's the right thing to do, or a silent understanding that it's not okay to flap my hands, or that I'm supposed to make eye contact even though that's exhausting. Being disabled is also a constant experience of being told that you can't do things because of your disability, and not being given the resources to make that possible, and therefore trying to figure out backdoor ways of making it possible because dang it, I'm gonna do the thing that I set my mind to do. And through this lens, it is very much a persistent demand for autonomy in a way that is a clear trauma response and response to being a minority person. We have learned that the world does not like us the way that we are, and it doesn't let us do things that we are wholly capable of doing, so we get into the habit of being aggressively the way that we are, and finding new and creative ways to make things possible. And we perceive things that are in the way of that as some sort of threat at which we may end up lashing out if we are not in an emotional space to be able to process or handle that. And a lot of the time, that lash out is reasonably calling someone out for discriminatory behavior. Albeit often not the most calmly or eloquently, because we are in fight or flight when that happens, in which case the people being called out for the problematic behavior usually latch on to the method of that call out and try to punish the person for calling out behavior rather than listen to the actual important message behind it of, oh, maybe I was discriminatory and didn't realize it. And yes, when it is a trauma response, it's going to probably be a little bit sooner than expected. And it's probably going to be a little less organized than expected. And it's probably going to be a little more out of proportion than expected. And this is where things get tricky, right? Because I personally have been in situations recently where I've been on both sides of this, and it looks very, very different depending on where you are. Like on the side where the person is lashing out at you because you are their loss of autonomy and they see you in the way, first of all, it sucks a lot. But second of all, you find yourself being like, well, they could have done this way easier solution than how they behaved, and they handled this really immaturely, and I'm really hurt by how they treated me, and I never want to talk to them again. But then on the side where you find yourself in that fight or flight towards somebody else or something else, you're trying to find the easiest solution, but nothing is clear cut, and the longer you wait, the more stressed you seem to get. So you try your best to communicate the best that you can, and then run out of there, and when you run away, you feel like, sure, maybe I didn't do my best, but given the circumstances, I did what I could because I felt very cornered. And looking back on that behavior once you're out of fight or flight, there's some level of like, not embarrassment, like that's not the right word, it's not that far, but it's definitely a twinge of like, that didn't happen how I would have liked it to, but we dealt with it, we're out of there, we're gonna move on and forget about it. This is the end of your processing journey. But the problem is that on the other end, that's the beginning of their processing journey, because this is new to them. So it inevitably comes back around unless you just ignore that person for the rest of eternity, which is often not possible, but sometimes we try to do that. But here lies this tricky situation of, yes, this is more or less understandable, reasonable, and a semi-rational trauma response to a need for autonomy and a need for feeling safe and in control and not discriminated against. However, it can sometimes manifest as not taking no for an answer in a way that's perceived as manipulative or controlling or perceived as going behind people's backs or perceived as immaturity or rudeness. Which, first of all, maturity is a concept I have issue with, but putting that aside, I would love to look at this and say it's a cultural difference that both sides of a relationship need to figure out how to navigate together, and it should not be entirely on the shoulders of the disabled person because that is entirely the truth. However, I will also say that in many situations, if you explain it like that, people are going to say they're using disability as an excuse for poor behavior and not be willing to find a middle ground or accommodate your needs. Because that's how the world works. So I think we're going to try to look at it through that nuance a little bit and try to find two ways forward here. First way forward is reframing things, learning to forgive yourself, realizing that there's no inherent harm in being persistently autonomous, and finding these words for how you experience the world. And the second part is now using that knowledge to find ways that you can help to self-regulate, that you can accommodate yourself and you can ask others to accommodate you, and learn how to see these patterns as they happen and communicate them clearly early on in the process before they suddenly get out of hand and explode. So the first thing, we have the general diagnostic criteria from earlier. That's helpful to put words to things. I've kind of made sense of all of this by understanding this so-called pathological demand avoidance. It's a different manifestation of issues with executive functioning, which is a hallmark of both ADHD and autism, in combination with a very reasonable trauma response to being a disabled person in a world built for the non-disabled, or a queer person in the world built for the non-queer, or a trans person in the world built for non-trans people, which all of those minority identities really just cover a solid chunk of the population. As an autistic person, I have a brain that holds on to expectations and routines to find my calm in a world that makes absolutely no sense. And also my brain has a killer sense of inertia, where once it's stuck on something, it has a really hard time breaking out of that, whether that's to stop going after something or start doing something new, especially if that's something I don't initiate, because then it doesn't have that extra push of, well, I want to in it. And that's basically a description of executive functioning issues, if you're not familiar with those, which is how autism and ADHD are diagnosed. I've also looked back at the outward PDA expressions and the inward PDA expressions and realized that I used to do outward ones as a kid, and I was told that that was improper behavior. And so rather than learn to cope with those big emotions, all of those big emotions just went inside instead. So I thought I had it figured out. I thought I'd figure out ways to cope because everybody from the outside was like, you're doing so much better. But now I'm realizing that, like, yeah, but no, because they just transitioned to other things. And those are the other things that I'm still working on to this day. I've also reframed those terms to be more accurate to me, with outward expressions of PDA being most often kick-ass disability rights mode that sometimes gets a little bit too passionate, and inward expressions of PDA being my own learned helplessness. And learned helplessness, if you're not a psychology person, is basically when a person continuously faces a negative, uncontrollable situation, and eventually they just stop trying to change their circumstances. They just shut up and take it. Sometimes I find myself being kick-ass disability rights mode until I give up and learned helplessness kicks in. Other times I just keep quiet and I seem like the perfectly compliant person until eventually I hit my tolerance threshold and I either completely quit the thing or I start fighting seemingly out of the blue. And we can name all of this and we can pathologize all of this all we want, but when it comes down to it, it's really just human behavior that applies on some level to all people on some level. I said on some level twice in a row. But rather than go, oh, they're a bad person who can't handle things, we can now learn from this and be a little more accepting and thoughtful about the situations people might be in that got them to that point. However, very important caveat here, this does not mean that we are defending abusive behavior or keeping people in our lives who treat us terribly or make us feel bad about ourselves. That is never, never okay. You do not deserve that. This is more of a way to understand that, like, maybe somebody who messed up once had a little bit more going on and you can talk it through with them if you want to work in that relationship, or that this puts that thing from when you were younger that you continue to be really embarrassed about to this day into a bit of a clearer perspective and you can get some closure on that. It's not like, oh, this person is autistic and they make me feel like a terrible person every single day, but it's okay because they can't help it. It's never that situation, ever. That is absolutely not okay, and I'm not saying that at all, and I want to clarify that. But let's talk about some ways that we can accommodate and plan ahead for where things might get a little rocky. Because once trust and appropriate accommodations are established with an extroverted PDA child or adult, they often share their external experience with us. Things for other people to know. My first note here says, if it makes no sense and I have no choice, it's not happening, which is very entertainingly worded, but it is also wholly correct. A great way to get somebody whose brain is bad at doing the motivation to be motivated by something is to explain to them why it's happening. Give them more than one option of how to make it happen, give directions clear enough to feel structured, but not so structured as to be forceful or restrictive, and give ample time to process and then enact that thing. Also give somebody the ability to say no or to choose something else, because the general feeling of panicked loss of autonomy and then leveling behavior is usually caused by a feeling of being cornered. I often call it tiger in a cage behavior. So figure out how to present the option or the options as distinctly not a cage. The other thing that I don't think gets talked about enough, both here and in the realm of trauma-informed practices, is that while a lot of it is how something is presented, if it's nice and polite and respectful, somebody's more likely to listen to you, it also depends on who's presenting the thing. Because as much as I don't like to categorize people, trauma brains love to categorize people, and they figure out the types of people who tend to do the most damage in regards to discrimination or emotional hurt pretty quickly. So therefore, the threshold for this person in interactions with that person to break is much, much lower than it would be with them interacting with somebody else. For example, I was raised and socialized as a girl and constantly told that because I am very trusting of people and I struggle with social cues, I should be extra wary of men, which is binary, whatever, we're ignoring that for a second, because men are going to try to take advantage of me. So at this point in my life, if a cis man tells me to do something in the same tone as a cis woman or a non-binary person or anybody else, I will automatically be less likely to do that thing or feel safe doing that thing that the cis man has told me to do, and I will feel more on edge around him no matter what. And there's not a whole lot that I can do about that. And like when I teach, I know that many of my students of color are going to automatically feel safe around a teacher of color, and that it's going to take extra time to prove to them that I am a safe person. Or I may never be a safe person to them, and that's okay, and I don't take offense to that. I just create alternative modes of communication so they feel like that they have options and can get to a point of trust on their own time. And if they never get there, That is okay. It is very common for queer people to feel more uneasy around older people for the same reason. Generally, people in oppressed minorities will probably feel more uneasy around people who hold power. All of this is just in community trauma. It's an anthropological thing. It happens, and we need to accept that that's a reality. And part of acknowledging privilege is acknowledging that people in minority groups may never trust you or may automatically want to do the opposite of what you say. And I've gone on a tangent, but what I'm trying to say is that a great way to accommodate for PDA behavior is to understand your own privilege and realize that it may have something to do with how somebody interacts with you and with the guidelines that you set for them. And that just because you are in one minority does not mean that a different minority will feel safe around you. Also, somebody could be in your minority and also in a different one that makes them still intimidated by you. And that's just another thing to plan for. I generally function assuming that everybody is somewhat afraid of me, and I try my best to make them feel safe, and that seems to work for me. But anyway, that's more of a trauma-informed practices conversation than PDA conversation, but there's a lot of overlap there, so I just wanted to bring that up. If you want to learn about trauma-informed practices, highly recommend that you do. I have a video about that up here. But anyway, so my list for things to accommodate yourself is on the smaller side because this is something I'm still navigating every day. Sometimes I'm able to create little games to make myself motivated to do something. Sometimes I'm able to connect a thing to one of my special interests to suddenly make it exciting and rewarding, but sometimes I spend entire days just staring at a to-do list, being stressed and unable to do anything on there. But I think a good step is what we talked about earlier. Being able to put into words and go, I'm not defective, I'm just different, is really, really a big help. Sometimes being able to just go, yep, my brain does this, but I can't do this right now because I don't have time for my brain to be doing this, and pushing through is genuinely effective for me because for some reason, because my motivation for doing a thing is so frequently, they tell you that you're too disabled to do this thing, why not beat myself at my own game and reframe it that way and then do it? Brains are so weird. I also highly recommend sticking to routines and planning things long ahead of time so you know what to expect and you don't have any stressful surprises to throw you off your rhythm. Finding safe ways to find and regain control of your life, even if it's small things, can go a very long way. And most importantly, try to catch things early. Notice when you're starting to experience fight or flight early and name that in that situation so you can stop it before it ends up spiraling out of control. It's also okay to pick flight. You don't have to pick fight for every single thing. Pick your battles that are going to be productive and actually change something. Those are battles you might want to fight. Otherwise, just leave them. Like, you're going to burn out really quickly, and that's not worth your energy. But anyway, that's all I have on this. If you have any ways that you trick your brain into doing things or ways that you navigate PDA, please put them in the comments. Always willing to have more information, ideas. I feel like this discussion in the sense of self-regulation in the autistic adult community is fairly new in comparison to how often it's spoken about in the world of navigating it as a parent or an educator. So hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully you learned something. And as always, thanks for listening. Thanks for learning. Remember, it's never too late to start over. And I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.